How's everybody doing? I think all is good here. If it isn't, someone can let me know, and we're gonna get started here. So, I think most people are here. So, as we've covered in previous events here, my name is Kevin, and I'm a chiropractor here in Gainesville, Virginia, which most of you know. This is me down here on off of Route 29, just south of Linton Hall. And I work in this building, which is a big multi-medical practice facility, and I work in a physical therapy practice and just sort of rent a room as a private room in this PT office. So I'm an instructor for a few different techniques. This one is active release techniques. It's a soft tissue based treatment for healthcare providers who teach the continuing education courses for that. More importantly, with respect to what we're talking about tonight, I'm the director of the U.S. division of the running clinic, so we teach continuing education courses to healthcare providers on diagnosing running injuries and treating running injuries and gait analysis, and you name it, we talk about it. So I also have somewhat of a running background in marathons and Ironman. And basically the last 10 years of my life have been all about teaching running and treating pro triathletes and treating recreational runners and running myself. So before we continue, I always have this little disclaimer. Me and the company that I work for, the running clinic, we have no financial relationships with any commercial interests. So everything that I talk about is because this is what the research says. This isn't what because somebody told me to say, right? If you have any questions, I'm asking that you hold those off to the end. This is supposed to be half an hour, so I just want to make sure that everybody, if they have things to do at the end of half hour, that we're not running overtime. So I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. So as a brief synopsis here, this is the last week. We're on week 4. Week 1, we talked about the anatomy and the physiology of evolution and how it seems like as humans we were evolved to be endurance runners. It's really compelling evidence that we evolved to run, so therefore we probably should be running. But along with that, we have lots of running injuries, which doesn't really make sense if we were born to run. Something is wrong with that. We know that popular opinion is not always best. We talked about a study where they looked at what the running population generally feels as good injury prevention strategies, and we know that there was a lot of those that were completely wrong. Footwear and stretching and different things like that. Not really the best ideas for injury prevention. We talked about that load versus capacity is the number one cause of running injuries. So load meaning if you increase your mileage or like too quickly, or your speed too quickly, or your footwear too quickly, there's a sudden change in load quicker than your body can adapt, and the capacity of the tissue isn't meeting the load that you're applying, and the capacity can depend on your stress levels and your age and your sleep and all of those things. We talked about that in depth. We talked about running and knee OA and how running is not hard on your knees, despite popular opinion. It actually seems to be beneficial and preventive for knee osteoarthritis. And we talked about how to know if your running is too much, okay? In week 2, we talked about biomechanics, and we looked at examples of biomechanics of pro runners, and we looked at how messed up their biomechanics can be. So is biomechanics really that important? We looked at all the research, not all of the research, it was a half an hour lecture, but a summary of the research for like arch height, pronation, leg length discrepancies, if your knee dives in, if your arm swing is off. We looked at that. Those things don't matter. The things that do matter is loading rate, which is how hard you hit the ground, cadence, which is the quickness of the turnover of your running. Those are the 2 main biomechanic factors that are linked with injury. And we talked about the idea of don't rush to change. If you are injured, look at your load capacity relationship before you ever look at biomechanics. Because if it's just that you increased your load too quickly and somebody tells you, oh, you need to change your biomechanics, you change your biomechanics, that means you're going to change where the load is, and you're probably going to put load on a tissue that isn't used to it, and you're more likely to get injured. So don't be in a rush to change. Last week, we talked about shoes and injury. What exactly do they do? Do they stop pronation? No, they don't stop pronation. Your foot moves around in the shoe. They don't really do what they say they do. We looked at a lot of studies that have matched shoe type to the arch type. There's no reduction in injury compared to people who are just randomly given a shoe. And to begin with, arch type and pronation aren't linked with injury anyway, so what the hell do we care? Does motion control prevent injury? No. Does cushioning prevent injury? No. Does heel to toe drop matter as far as performance or injury? No. So the real big difference with shoes is whether you're going to be in more minimalist shoes or sort of traditional shoes. And we looked at the idea that minimalist shoes tends to increase cadence and reduce loading rate, which should reduce overall injuries. But don't assume that it does, because when you switch to a pair of minimalist shoes, you're going to increase the risk of metatarsal stress fractures. You're going to increase the risk of Achilles tendinopathy, calf injuries, things like that. So if you want to switch to a more minimalist pair of shoes, you have to be really, really judicious with the transition of getting there. So maybe it's not necessarily the best plan for everybody. And we walked through, like, who would it be good for? So that's what we talked about last week. And then we talked about, if you want to change to a pair of more minimalist shoes, how would you execute that? So that is 3 weeks worth of information in less than 5 minutes. Today, we're not talking about injury, we're talking about performance. So I already just did a quick review of weeks 1 to 3. This week, we're only going to talk about these 3 things: the hierarchy of performance needs. We're going to talk about what running economy is, and we'll do a brief summary. What the hell are we talking about with a hierarchy? You guys have all seen this. This is obviously severely outdated. Now this is the food pyramid, where what they said is the base. In other words, the majority of what you should eat is grains in terms of bread and pasta and whatnot. We know now that that's probably not a great idea. But as you move to the top of the pyramid, like food and drinks high in fat and sugar, those are ones that should comprise a very small amount of your diet. So in other words, just because it's at the top doesn't mean it's most important. You want the base of your diet to be more healthy foods. And yes, I know this is outdated. I'm putting it up as an example, and that's it. More importantly, we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pretty big popular thing in psychology. You know, as the base, we need air, food, water, shelter, things like that. And then the necessity of the things that pile on top of that are less and less important as you get to the top of the pyramid. So moving on, what is Kevin's hierarchy for running performance? If you want to get faster, what should you do? Let's look at it. First of all, pretty easy. Don't get injured. Number 2, sorry, this paused. Don't get injured. Number 2, running volume. More volume is better. Number 3, training distribution, strengthening, biomechanics, shoes, and other crap. So we're going to talk about each one of these individually as we go. So number 1 being avoid getting injured. Do I really need references? I didn't bother finding any. If you're going to spend half the season of your cross-country season, or if your marathon training season injured, guess what? You're not going to perform very well. Simple fact. This isn't rocket science. I don't need to perform references for you with this. Don't get injured. That's the number 1 thing. That's what we've talked about for the last 3 weeks. So the last 3 weeks, you could essentially say, we've been talking about how to improve your performance, because you're going to try to avoid injuries with all those things that we talked about. Okay? Number 1. Number 2, volume. The more volume you run, the better you're going to be. That is the second thing that I have above injury. Why do I say that? Tons of studies. That's why I say that. There's lots of studies on elite runners, okay, showing that the more volume that they run, the faster they're going to be. But what about recreational runners? Let's look at this study that was published 4 years ago. An empirical study of race times in recreational endurance runners. They looked at 2,500 runners, and what they found was the more they ran, the faster they were able to complete race times. So over here on the vertical column, we have the velocity in terms of minutes per mile. So in other words, if you're running at 10 minutes per mile, that's slower than 8 minutes per mile, right? And if you look at the weekly mileage, the more weekly mileage that these 2,500 runners ran, the faster they were able to complete 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, and marathons. Okay, it doesn't matter what the distance is. The more you do, the more you're going to be able to complete a race faster. Okay, and this chart was adjusted for age and body mass index. So if we exclude those confounding factors, this is just the more mileage you run in a week, generally the faster you're going to be. Pretty simple. It's just an adaptation. Okay. So then you're going to say, but Kevin, the more you run, the more likely you are to get injured. And that's violating your number one rule. And look at Kevin, I have all of these studies to back me up on this claim that the more running volume you do, the more likely you get injured. In fact, I couldn't even keep track because there's too many to include. You're right, there are those studies. And what I'm going to say back to you is, okay, let's look at these studies that say higher workloads are not associated with injury. Lots of studies on runners and other sports, but mostly runners, showing that higher volume is not associated with injury. And then I'm going to continue and say, oh, there's too many to include, just like you said. But let's take it a step further. I'm also going to present to you all of these studies that say that higher running volumes are actually protective of injury. Okay, and guess what? There's too many to include. All right, so the idea is absolute training load is much less important than spikes in training. You don't want to ramp up too quickly. You want to stay consistent, okay? Absolute training load is much less important than spikes in training, okay? Because look at all these studies that show that a spike in training correlates to a spike in injury rates. We talked about this on week 1, right? We also talked about poor sleep and lots of stress. Those are correlated with injury as well. But guess what? There's too many to include. So if we look at this guy, Tim Gabbett, he's kind of the world leader in the epidemiology of injuries and tracking who gets injured and who doesn't. And his quote is great. High loads are not the problem. It's how you get there that's the real issue. Be gradual in your progression and you're going to be fine. Okay, your body will adapt. But just because I'm so into research and I'm so on top of things, I'm going to post this study 3 days ago. This paper came out. You can see the date, May 18th. Training for a half and full marathon. So there's both included in this. Training volume and longest endurance run related to performance and running injuries by Fokuma. I did not curse. I mentioned him last week. Good researcher to reference because it's fun to say Fokuma. All right, 1,000 runners who ran half marathons and marathons, they were given a questionnaire at the beginning of their training and after their half marathon or their marathon. And guess what they found? More training volume correlated to a faster finishing time. That's what they found. The more you run, the faster you're going to finish your half marathon or your marathon. And more training volume was not associated with more injuries. Why is that? Because we already talked about it. This is what we spent the most time on week 1. If you remember, I showed this slide and I said, this is the most important slide we're going to talk about. The body adapts. The body will adapt to mechanical loads as long as the applied load doesn't exceed the capacity for the body to adapt. So it doesn't matter what you do. Well, I mean, to a point, like I said, if you get hit by a bus, I don't think your body's going to adapt to that. But as far as running goes, if you ramp up quickly, you're going to be more likely to get injured. If you ramp up slowly, your body will adapt to that. You're going to be fine. All right. There's a lot of things that play a role in that as far as age, tissue capacity, sleep, stress, things like that. Okay. We talked about all that on week 1. If you missed it, come on in the office. We will talk about it. So that was volume. Next is training distribution. I'm kind of flying through this because this is only a half-hour lecture, right? I mean, there's so many studies we could talk about, but just kind of going through this. We're going to get into the weeds here for a second with training distribution. What do I mean by that? So many of you have heard zone 1 training, zone 2, zone 3, right? They're delineated by these things up here called lactate threshold and ventilatory threshold. When you hit your lactate threshold, you switch from zone 1 to zone 2. When you hit ventilatory threshold 1, you switch from zone 1 to zone 2. Basically, zone 1 means aerobic. You're in the aerobic zone, so you're burning fat. Zone 2 is anaerobic, which uses the glycolysis system to burn more carbohydrates for energy. And then zone 3 is mostly creatine phosphatase, which you use for high energy production in terms of like sprinting and whatnot. But in zone 2, when you're in glycolysis and you're burning carbohydrates, there's a byproduct of that you recycle, and pyruvate gets turned to lactate, and that produces hydrogen ions, which lowers the pH of your blood, so it makes it more acidic. And in order to blow off that acidity, you blow it off in the form of carbon dioxide through bicarbonate. And so your ventilatory threshold, in other words, your breathing rate, is going to spike. If you're running at, let's say, 9-minute miles, and you're talking to your friend and you guys are having a good conversation, and then you go to like 8:30s, you're going to notice all of a sudden you can't have a full sentence with your friend. You can only get like 4 words out, and you got to take a breath. 5 words out, and you have to take a breath. What that means is that you've gone from the aerobic energy production system to the anaerobic energy production system, because your breathing rate spikes. We generally don't want to be in there when we're doing endurance training. We want to be below the ventilatory threshold 1. We want to be in zone 1. Okay? This is a 3-zone system. There's also some people have seen this 5-zone system, where basically zone 1 in a 5-zone system correlates to the first 2, like the first 2 zones in the 5-zone system correlates to zone 1 in the 3-zone system, and zone 4 and 5 in the 5-zone system correlates to zone 3. So it's really the same thing. Okay? So as your exercise intensity increases, you're going to hit this VT1, which is ventilatory threshold 1, and your breathing, your minute violation, is going to spike. You're going to start taking more breaths per minute. You're not going to be able to, say the alphabet out loud. You're not going to be able to speak in a full sentence. You're not going to be able to sing a song as you're running. If you're below VT1, you could probably run with your mouth closed and just breathe through your nose. Those are sort of indications that you're in zone 1 training. Okay, this is what I mean by training distribution. So how should we distribute it? Well, what I advocate through a lot of research is this thing called the polarized training method, which is down here on the bottom. And what that means is 80% of your training runs should be in zone 1, virtually none of it should be in zone 2, and 20% of it should be at the track doing interval training at such an intensity that you're going to fall over and puke. Not really, but fast. What most Western country runners do, Western society, is this lactate threshold training. So most of the runs are in zone 2, where they can only get 4 or 5 words out because they're working hard. Okay? So let's look at a couple studies on that. This was a study back in 2001. Physical and training characteristics of top class marathoners. So we're talking marathoners in this study of 2:06 to 2:11 marathon time. So they're running, significantly below 5-minute miles for an entire marathon. These are the world's elite. And when they looked at all their training distribution, this is what they did. 78% of it was in zone 1, so much slower than marathon pace. They did hardly any of it at marathon pace, and about 20% of it was faster. So in other words, track repeats. Okay, let's look at another study. This was on recreational athletes, and what they did is they did 4 different groups. They said, okay, we're going to take these endurance athletes, we're going to split them up into 4 different groups. The first group down here, high volume, low intensity. So you can see the low intensity, it was well over 80%. Zone 2 was here, and that's supposed to be red, but they hardly did any at high intensity. Threshold training is all zone 1 and zone 2 with no speed work. High intensity training is slow or fast with nothing in between, but mostly fast. And polarized training, again, is typically polarized training is around 80% low intensity. This paper didn't quite get there, but you get the idea. And after 6 months of training, this is what ended up happening. So we have VO2 max change in the blue, economy change, time to exhaustion change, and then velocity and power changes here. You can see the polarized group kicked ass. They did the best, followed by the high intensity training. Look who sucked. The lactate threshold training group. The training method that is used by most runners in Western society. It performs the worst. So if you want to become a faster runner, first of all, don't get injured, do lots of volume, and of that volume, 80% of that volume should be in zone 1. You should be running really slowly to the point where you can have full conversations, say the alphabet, all that. Okay, you want to be right on the brink of going past VT1, okay, but not past it. So this idea called run slower or train slower to race faster. 80% of the mileage below ventilatory threshold 1, 20% above. That's backwards. I screwed that up. 80% of the mileage is supposed to be, I don't know my greater and less than signs. It's supposed to be less than VT1 and 20% of the mileage faster than VT2. Sorry about that. So we got this quote by Jason Fitzgerald, who's a top running coach in the world, or in the country anyways. He's written a few books. The big trend amongst most runners, easy runs are too fast and workouts are too slow. Training in the middle is where PRs go to die. Don't train in zone 2. Okay? That's training distribution. Let's move on to strengthening. This is the new way everybody's running with masks because of COVID. No, I'm kidding. This is not. This runner is running in a lab and she's having her running economy tested. So what that is they measure the amount of oxygen that she's consuming and they measure the amount of carbon dioxide that she's expelling. That way you can figure out what kind of fuel she's burning, but you can also find out how much oxygen she's using per kilogram of body weight per minute, which gives you your running economy. It's the exact same as fuel economy in a car where it's like how many gallons per mile or how many miles per gallon do you use to drive your car, right? So running economy is a measure of how much oxygen do you use to run at a certain pace, okay? So if we take a group of runners and we have them run at, let's say, 9-minute miles, we measure how much oxygen they use per minute, and then we apply an intervention, whether it's shoes, or in this case, we're going to talk about strengthening or whatever, and you have them come back, like in terms of strengthening, let's say a 9-week strengthening program, and you have them run at 9-minute miles again. Half of them did strength training, half of them didn't. And you say, oh, the strength training group now uses less oxygen to run at 9-minute miles. So their running economy has improved compared to the group that didn't do the strength training. You get the idea. So what we have is 2.8% improvement in running economy. We have an improvement in time trial performance of 3 to 5% for middle distance, 2 to 4% for long distance. Time trial improvement despite a reduction in training mileage for a 10K, but the benefit is lost after 6 weeks. So let's tear those apart for a second. So this study by Rich Blagrove in 2018, looking at, his was a systematic review. So they looked at all these different studies that have ever been done, and they said all these studies range from improvement of 2% in running economy to 8% in running economy. And in middle distance runners, so in other words, anything under than a mile, like we're talking like 800 meters to typically 400 to a mile, we'd consider middle distance, depending on the study. Certain countries define middle distance as different, but a 5%, 3 to 5% improvement. So if we work that into real terms, if you're running like, let's say you're running a 5:30 mile, and you improved your performance by 4%, that would be 15 seconds off your mile PR just by adding strength work. So it's pretty significant. Long distance, anywhere from a mile and above, you're going to improve on average by about 3%. So if you work that out for a marathon, it's about 15 minutes off your marathon time. Pretty significant. Improvements in 10K, time trial performance despite a reduction in training mileage. So some people have argued, if you take runners and everybody's running the same amount, but this group adds strength training, yeah, they're going to get faster, but that's because they're just generally doing more training. So this paper by Lum in 2019, he said, okay, let's actually reduce the amount of running time that this group is doing, but we're going to supplement that with training so they do the same amount of hours of work. And despite the fact that they were running less, when they added strength training, they actually improved their 10K time trial. But if you stop doing the strength training, those gains go away after about 6 weeks. So it's important to keep up the strength training, okay? So what does the strength training look like? We're talking reps and sets. So the reps, the amount of weight that you have to do needs to be more than 60% of your 1 rep max. So in other words, you can't go light. If you're doing body weight squats and things like that, that's not going to work. You have to be going heavy with this in order to get an improvement in running economy. Okay. This says 60%. Most studies actually say more than 70% of your 1 rep max. So generally that equates to, let's say you're doing squats, 70% of your 1 rep max is generally going to equate to about 7 or 8 repetitions of the squats before you're like, whew, I'm cooked. I can't do 1 more rep. That's generally where you need to be with that. Okay. So 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps for the strength. Explosive resistance training is kind of the same as strength training, but you're doing it at a much faster velocity. So you lower the rate, or you lower the weight. But let's say, like if we want to mimic like a squat, we could do medicine ball toss where you squat down with the medicine ball and you throw it as high as you can. That's a squatting motion, but it's explosive, right? So you're going to use anything up to 60%, right? You don't want to go heavy in that because you're doing it explosively, right? Plyometrics, on the other hand, is like jump rope, the agility ladder, burpees, maybe box jumps, things like that. Okay. And then you want to avoid going to failure if you're in mid-season, right? Like you don't want to be going to failure and having your muscles really sore when you're hitting the peak season for whatever it is, cross country or marathon training or whatever. But generally in your off season, when your running volume is lower, you can go to failure. All right. So you want to generally start with compound movements like squats, deadlifts, lunges, things like that before you start doing isolated things like knee extensions and leg curls. We want to do that about 2 to 3 times a week, maybe less around competition time. Obviously, you want to work generally on lower body, and then technique. You can get a coach. You can come in. I can coach you on technique for these types of things. But I would suggest that if you're not used to doing strength training, and what I'm suggesting is that you go heavy, you get some good technique coaching. Don't just jump into it without knowing what you're doing. Okay, so that's strengthening. Moving on to biomechanics. We talked about this a little bit last week, but in general, if you want to have an efficient running technique, you want to have an initial contact of your foot far ahead of you. So in other words, if you want to run inefficiently, take a longer stride so that you put your foot out in front of you and it breaks you every time you run. You don't want that, right? It increases braking force. You go up and down a lot more when you take a longer stride compared to a shorter stride. You're trying to go this way, but you're wasting your time doing vertical motion. And in general, when you have a longer stride, you're going to have a lower step rate or a lower cadence. We have lots of studies that show that if you increase people's cadence, generally they become more efficient. Okay. So if you want to be more efficient, land closer under your center of mass, close to a mid-foot strike, not a big heel strike. And we want to have a cadence of around 180. And as we talked about last week with the shoes, generally that efficient running style is comparable to barefoot running. And the other way is more comparable to people wearing big cushy shoes. Like we talked about those 4 or 5 studies comparing Hokas to regular shoes, where the more cushioning you have, generally you lower cadence, you increase vertical loading rate, and it's generally not a good thing, right? And then this last thing that popped up, smile. Definitely want to smile when you run. We'll talk about that in a second. So that's biomechanics. When it comes to shoes, we got this guy, Wouter Hoopgammer. He's out of the University of Massachusetts. He took sub 20-minute 5K runners. So, not bad runners, not fantastic, but good. Did a triple crossover design. And what he said is we're going to take the base shoe weight and we're going to look at their base time. But then, unknowingly to the runners, we're going to inject little metal BBs in their shoes, 100 grams and 300 grams. And then the next week when they come back, the runners have no idea that anything has been done to their shoes. Some runners are going to be running in their base shoe. Some runners are going to be running with 300 grams. Some runners are going to be running with 100 grams. And then the next week after that, we're going to switch groups all around. So if you take your base shoe weight and you look at your good time for a 3K and you add 100 grams to that shoe, you're going to add on average 4 seconds to your 3K time. If you add 300 grams, you're going to add 15 seconds to your 3K time. So that means if you're a cross-country runner and you're running in, let's say, like a Brooks Beast, which is a really heavy shoe compared to like a lightweight racing flat or spikes, which are very lightweight, you're gonna, so this is a 3K, this paper was on 3K. Generally in cross country, you're gonna do 5K, or in college, if you're a guy, you're gonna do an 8K. That's a huge cost savings just by lightening your shoe, okay? This was a systematic review by Fuller, and what they said is for every 100 grams that you add to a shoe, you reduce your running economy. So in other words, you make your running economy worse by almost 1%. There's a 100 gram extra to the shoe, 1% loss in running economy. And in a marathon, that's going to equate to about 10 minutes. So significant time saving there. What about a minimalist shoe versus standard? We talked about that last week. Generally, a more minimalist shoe is more efficient than a standard shoe. And what about technology? Cushioning, with respect to cushioning, if you don't have much cushioning at all, so like if you're barefoot, it hurts to hit the ground, so you're not going to want to go fast. But if you have a big cushy shoe, like a Hoka or something like that, if you can imagine trying to run fast on like high jump pits, like you sink in, you lose the bounce of your tendons. So more cushioning isn't good. So according to these studies, generally between 15 and 20 millimeter stack height is the most efficient. Rigidity, you want a more rigid shoe a little bit. Drop and motion control don't make a difference at all. And then we have these materials that are built in for energy return. We're going to talk about that in a second. But generally, the lighter is better, depending on the individual habits, okay? So at the bottom, what about these magic Nike shoes that everybody talks about? What the hell? What's up with those? So this was the Nike Zoom Vaporfly 4%. Why was it called 4%? Because we have a bunch of studies that showed that if you wear these shoes, you improve your running economy by 4% on average, okay? It's foam, followed by a curved carbon fiber plate, followed by foam, and then the outsole. So Ian Hunter, Water Hoopgammer, he was the guy who did the study with the metal BBs in the shoe. And Kyle Barnes, they all did studies. There was another one where they looked at runners and they measured their running economy. And if they wore the Nike Vaporfly compared to a standard pair of shoes, there was a 4% improvement in running economy. But now we have the updated Nike Air Zoom Alpha Fly Next Percent. Next Percent, because there hasn't been any studies on it, we don't know how much it improves. But if you remember Eliud Kipchoge, he just set the world record in the marathon. This is what he was wearing. In the same weekend in Chicago, I can't remember her name, female runner broke the world record in the marathon. This is what she was using. There's a lot of arguments going on. You know, you're not, if you're like if you're in the Paralympics and you have an amputee and they have one of those carbon fiber curved legs, that's more efficient than running against an able-bodied person. So if you have one of those, you're actually not allowed to compete against able-bodied people because you're at an advantage. There's a lot of people arguing with this curved plate. Is that actually legal? The Olympics just recently ruled that yes, it is going to be legal if we ever have Olympics again. So those studies were done on runners that ran 10Ks in under 31 minutes. So these are really, really fast runners. So then this study comes along with Kim Mibert-Lossier out of New Zealand, and she tested this on recreational runners. I know this study well because she couldn't get the shoes in New Zealand, so she called me to order the shoes, and then I shipped them to her. So I was anticipating the study coming out. But they took recreational runners, and they said, okay, we're going to compare you with a racing flat, so in other words, a light shoe compared to your normal shoe, compared to these Nike 4%. We're going to run you at 3 different speeds. And what they found was the best performance in these recreational runners, 61% of them were in the Nike 4%, 22% were just in a light shoe, and 17% were in their own shoe. Running economy, less than half of them had the best performance in the Nike shoe, 12% in a flat shoe, and 41% were inconsistent, depending on whether they're running at 60% or 70% or 80% of the VO2 max. So if you put it all together, only 29% of runners showed a time trial and a running economy improvement in the Nike. So maybe it's good for exceedingly fast runners. Is it good for recreational runners? Debatable. But if you want to spend $250 and try, go ahead. That's shoes. Now we get to other. And what I mean by other, altitude training, heat training, compression gear, nutritional supplements. You know, how long are you going to taper before your marathon? Whatever. Weight loss is important. There's a couple studies that show that for every 1 pound that you lose, you gain 0.64% in improvement in time trial performance. Okay, but the way they did those studies is they had people running and they were measuring their running economy, and then they hooked them up to this strap that actually like lifted. They had pulleys and they were like lifted up to lower their body mass, and of course they became more efficient. But the problem with that is if you tell someone to lose a ton of weight, they're also going to lose muscle mass and they're going to lose bone density, and they're going to be more likely to get injured. If you followed that story with Mary Cain, you tell a runner to lose a lot of weight, they're going to restrict caloric intake, and then their bone density goes down. And she's throwing Alberto Salazar under the bus for like 5 stress fractures that she had over a 1.5 year period because she was told to lose weight. So I'm going to stay away from that topic. So as far as those other things, what I have to say about them, whatever. They're not going to make that big of a difference. If you want to try some altitude training by wearing, I mean, everybody's wearing those masks nowadays anyways, but you don't try that, whatever. I don't care. Whatever. It's not going to make nearly as big of a difference as all those other things. But there is one other thing. So let's look at this character. Who is this guy? This guy is finishing an Ironman. Okay, this was taken at the finish line. Does he look happy? Not really. He looks a little pissed off, even though he should have been happy because he was finishing an Ironman. I should talk to this guy. What happens if he was smiling? Well, Brick in 2018 looked at the running economy, believe it or not, in runners who smile when they run or runners who frown. And they did different trials where they made runners smile, they made runners frown. What happens to the running economy? They said periodic smiling actually improves running economy. In contrast, frowning increases effort and running, and like it worsens running economy. How much? Smiling improved running economy by 2.2%. So people are spending $250 on these Nike 4% when less than half of recreational runners actually respond to those. Save yourself some money. Smile. Just be happy. You get a 2.2% improvement in running economy. Awesome. All right. To summarize, don't get injured. Then run lots of volume. Most of it should be slow. 80% of it should be slow. Do some strengthening. Maybe work on your cadence a little bit. Wear a light pair of shoes, and the other stuff, whatever. For those of you who haven't been here, I'm leaving off every little webinar with this. There is no drug in use or being developed that shows as much promise to bring health to its users than a sustained physical activity program. Love that quote.